Chapter 10 Science and Prejudice. You could paint a picture of world history starting in 1775, with race prejudice spreading like a dark cloud, until, in the 1940s, it covers the whole planet. Only the explosion of World War II finally cracks the gloom and lets in sunlight. Yet, even as racial theories and racial prejudice spread and grew more toxic, they were not consistent. Race in Europe often meant something different from race in America. When you were defined who you were, so that getting on a boat to cross the Atlantic you could leave one race and join another. Today, these contradictions reveal how much the supposedly scientific idea of race was an invention that reflected local prejudices. But at the time, the way science was being distorted by prejudice was anything but obvious. In fact, the marriage of the two was so compelling that those 170 years could well be called the age of racism. To make sense of that era, we have to keep looking back and forth across the ocean. Only that way can we see how the most brilliant ideas and the most thorough, objective studies were put to the service of the most brutal, savage, and primitive hatreds. America. Black equals slave. The history of the United States is the history of the problem of race. No country on earth owes as much to the Enlightenment in its push to replace prejudice with reason. After all, America is not a collection of people who happen to live in one place for generations, ruled by a royal family. Instead, it was the very first nation to be founded on laws and principles. The Declaration of Independence expresses those fundamental beliefs in words that are still glorious today. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Yet those glowing phrases were written by Thomas Jefferson, who believed that Africans were an inferior race. It is easy to label Jefferson a hypocrite. A hypocrite is comfortable with his lies, and fears only being exposed. Jefferson was public about his judgments and tortured about his conflicts. Jefferson never freed his slaves, nor acknowledged the children he had with his slave and mistress, Sally Hemings. Yet in his first draft of the Declaration, the longest and most passionate complaint against the English is that though they brought slavery to America, Jefferson called slavery a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty. Jefferson's passage, which Georgia and South Carolina insist on removing from the Declaration, reads like a heroin addict raging at the dealer who sells him the drug he craves. Jefferson hated slavery and was absolutely dependent on it. That is the portion of many Americans from the era of founding fathers up through the Civil War. For slavery was a mainstay of the nation's economy, and that more Americans needed slave labor, the more certain they were that Africans were meant to be slaves. African slaves were first brought to Virginia in 1619, but for the next 100 years, neither law nor custom assumed that all Africans were slaves, though the poorest whites were any better off. A person at the very bottom of Virginia society could easily come from England or Ireland and have pearly white skin tone, and a very dark-skinned person whose parents had been born in Africa might be a free property owner and even able to vote. When the very same Oliver Cromwell who let the Jews back in England landed in Ireland to put down pro-Catholic revolt, he killed without mercy. He ruled that as of May 1st, 1654, any Irish who lived east of the River Shannon would be executed, unless they were sold off into slavery first. British sugar plantations in the Caribbean now began to be filled with Irish as well as African American Indian slaves, to the extent that, as a verb, to Barbados, an Irishman came to mean to kidnap and send them off into slavery. Henry Cromwell, one of Oliver's sons, thought that being enslaved would be good for the Irish. After all, who knows but it might be a means to make them Englishmen. Slavery was a kind of enforced education, and being Catholic and Irish was as good a reason for being sent to that harsh school as being dark-skinned and African. The laws enforced against Catholics in 18th century Ireland resemble nothing so much as the laws later passed against Africans in America. Although the Catholic Irish were the overwhelming majority of the population, they cannot vote or be elected to Parliament. They cannot live in certain towns. They cannot establish schools or teach in them, nor could they make or sell guns, newspapers, or books. The laws against Jews in Germany, even after the reign of Frederick II, were also a haunting forecast of the restrictions and humiliations imposed on blacks. White. In 1790, at the very beginning of the new nation, Congress passed a law allowing immigrants from other lands to become American citizens. They just needed to meet a few simple qualifications, starting with their race. Only free white persons were eligible. Unbelievable as it may seem, this law remained on the books until 1952. For nearly 3/4 of our nation's history, there was something special about being white. That made a person fit to become American. But what? The word free makes the meaning of white clear. The law assumed that only a white person could have the independence to think and vote as a citizen, or take up arms and serve in the militia. A non-white person might be owned by another or dominated by another, and so too easily influenced. His vote, his voice in a jury, would not be his own. White meant free. Exactly the same logic applied to women who were thought to be overly influenced by their husbands or men with no property, whose votes could be bought. A country is made up of free citizens. That was the vision of democracy that Thomas Paine articulated in Common Sense, that Jefferson expressed so eloquently in the Declaration of Independence, that so inspired so many farmers and cobblers and sailors to take up arms and follow George Washington into battle. But what if only certain special men have the capacity to be citizens, to think and debate ideas? Then the very devotion to freedom and independence that freed Americans from England would mean citizenship would have to be restricted to property-holding white men. All men, that is, those who are capable of acting as men, are created equal. There are some ways in which we still believe this. In most states, you cannot vote if you are mentally disturbed, that you cannot function. A voter, we believe, must be a free person able to make up his or her own mind. To many of the Founding Fathers, that was the very definition of being white. Restricting citizenships to whites was not as simple as it sounds, since no one was sure who fit the description. When the 1790 naturalization law was first proposed, Congress immediately debated whether Jews and Catholics really were white. Most of the Founding Fathers were precisely the kind of Northern European Protestants who tended to believe that freedom was their own racial heritage. Many came from families that had been allied with Cromwell in his wars against the Irish. Still, over some objections, Congress left the door open to those who were not European Protestants. That choice came to define a crucial difference between America and Europe. In America, because the definition of being white was linked with the capacity to be a good citizen, politicians, lawyers, and finally the Supreme Court all wrangled over the meaning of whiteness. Had the 1790 Congress decided against Jews and Catholics, race in America would have been defined as much by using Protestant as by pale skin tone. Ironically, then, by excluding non-whites, America could be more inclusive of non-Protestants. In England, for example, Catholics could not vote. The question of which meaning of race the country should use has come up again and again ever since. That shows how charged, yet how confused, is the idea of race. White equals not red. Dividing up Americans into black and white was never sufficient because the first Americans, the Indians, were self-evidently neither. Yet defining the red Americans raised problems of its own. In the 1830s, large parts of Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, and Tennessee were controlled by the Cherokee, who took every possible step to qualify as American citizens. The Cherokee modeled their laws on those of the United States. They turned to farming and accepted Christian missionaries, but land-hungry Americans did not think any of these actions mattered. Americans were white, Cherokee were not. They had to go. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, whom it recognized as an independent nation whose rights were protected by established treaties. President Andrew Jackson thought the court ruling was ridiculous, as he told Congress in 1833 that those tribes cannot exist surrounded by our settlements, and in continual contact with our citizens is certain. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement which are essential to any favorable change in their condition. If you turn the President's statement inside out, you can see his definition of white: intelligent, hard-working, moral, and interested in self-improvement. When Thomas Jefferson was growing up, he met a number of Cherokee who stopped by his father's farm. Jefferson liked and admired them, and did not find them in any way inferior. As president, he told a visiting delegation of Indians that they would mix with us by marriage. Your blood will run in our veins and will spread with us over this great land. But even Jefferson's admiration of the Indians was linked to a different form of racial prejudice, one that still exists. To this day, Indians are often described as innocent children who lived in the Garden of Eden, were perfectly in tune with nature, until the Europeans arrived. Authors who want to preach a message of concern for nature and ecology still often attribute the words to Indian leaders such as Chief Seattle, as if the Indians were spiritual, natural beings somehow mystically connected to the whole living planet. In fact, no one knows what Chief Seattle said about nature, and that most familiar version of his speech was written by a white author for a movie script. Real Indians have always used available technology to shape the environment to their needs. They burned forests to improve their soil and create better hunting zones. The great stands of trees that Europeans saw and assumed were ancient forests were actually the result of planned cycles of burning and regrowth. There's no reason to believe a single warrior worried that such fires might harm animal habitats or wipe out a rare species of plant. Those are modern concepts, not theirs. Seeing Indians as pure and innocent is the reverse of seeing them as lazy and savage. Either way, they are not hard-working, self-improving, or civilized. In other words, they are not white. In fact, the Cherokee farmers had done much more to demonstrate their intelligence and self-discipline than many whites. But that is how racial prejudice works. In one moment, whiteness is a way of behaving open to all, and in another, it is the color of your skin, no matter how you behave. Precisely because Jackson could not see past his own bias, he rejected the court ruling. By 1838, he found a faction of Cherokee willing to sign a treaty agreeing to leave, and their army forced the others to follow. Yet, had Jackson stood by the court ruling, it would have surely had sparked a civil war, with federal troops fighting Southern whites over the rights of Indians. As appealing as to imagine that alternate history, it could never have happened. Not enough white Americans, least of all Jackson, would have been willing to die for that cause.